In our last video, we looked at why some people believe that there is a transcendent reality or God. In this video, we're going to look at why some people believe there is not a transcendent reality or God. So let's look at some of those reasons. Again, just like we saw with people who believe there is a transcendent reality or God, some people believe that there's not just because they believe what others believe. Right? Or in this case, they don't believe in a transcendent reality or God just because other people don't believe in a transcendent reality or God. Not a good reason. Another reason that's not so great. They say, well, you don't need God to explain the origins of life and the universe, so God doesn't exist. That doesn't really hold up. We'll take a look at that one too. Also, this is a way that people express a psychological need for certainty. Again, you're seeing many of the same reasons that people believe in God are many of the same reasons that people do not believe in God, right? This reason I find, I understand it. I think that this is in many cases understandable and maybe even justifiable. That might be a strong word, but you can understand why people would see people using religion to do evil, right? Or people doing evil in the name of God. And you can see how that would cause people to say, well, that's just not true, right? They kind of would get rid of the whole, they say that everything those people say isn't true, right? And so sometimes people using the name of God to do evil are people practicing religiosity or bad religion can lead people to not believe in a transcendent reality. Also, sometimes people don't believe in a particular idea or a particular image of God, and then they think they don't believe in God at all. So we'll talk about that too. What they really just don't believe is in someone else's idea of the transcendent reality. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is none, right? It's just not the way. They just don't think it's the way that other people are talking about it. And finally, maybe some people haven't had personal experience. It's possible that some people have not had these experiences. Um, More likely, though, it's possible that people would have them and don't recognize them as signs of the transcendent. So they don't. It's likely that many people have subtle experiences of the transcendent, but don't recognize them as such. We'll take a look at all of these in this video. Okay, so the first one, not believing just because others don't believe. Right? Some people think that modern, rational, well-adjusted people don't believe in a transcendent reality or God. You know, you think about how people might be embarrassed to be found if they were found praying. Right? For a lot of people in our culture, belief in the transcendent world is almost something that should be personal or even secret. Right? But this is not really a good reason not to believe in the transcendent reality or God just because other people don't. Right? First of all, it's not accurate. Many modern, rational, well-adjusted people, including scientists, believe in God. Secondly, it's a form of blind faith just to believe something because everybody else does, right? Not without having without having any evidence for it. Right? It's not rational or scientific at all to say, oh, I believe this because these other people who say they're rational and scientific or appear rational and scientific, they say it too. That's not rational or scientific, right? So we should avoid blind faith when it comes both to believing in transcendent or not believing in transcendent, right? We believe that we should have reasons that we believe. Our belief should be supported by evidence. Another argument that sometimes people make is they say, well, we don't need God to have the universe. And I guess these people, the only reason that they think people believe in God is because it explains the origin of life and the universe. So, I mean, if you thought the only reason anybody believed in God is because it explained the origin of life of the universe, then I guess this would make sense. But um, it's this in itself is not really a good reason to believe that there's not a transcendent reality or God. I mean, just think about it. Like, just because something doesn't have to exist, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? I mean, nothing has to exist, but everything that exists does. Right? What I think that we're finding here is just a reaction to the false idea that the complexity of life proves the existence of God. So again, you might have people where that was just the only way that they had heard about God or experienced God, or they thought that's the only reason people believe in God. And then when you say to them, well, and then when that truth does come up, which it is true, right? We don't need God to explain the origins of life in the universe, right? Then they say, well, that's it, so there must be no God. But again, just because there doesn't have to be God, that doesn't mean God doesn't exist, right? Just because there doesn't have to be something, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, think about it. Nothing has to exist, right? But everything that exists does exist. Psychological need for certainty. Now, this is interesting because we've already seen how people use religion for their psychological need for certainty, but some people treat science in the same way, right? They want to know things for certain. And one way people deal with that is to just have this kind of absolutist fundamentalist uh, embrace of science and saying, well, science can tell us everything, and anything that is beyond the realm of science doesn't exist, right? This gives them a sense that they can know everything for certain, right? Because science will work and can tell us everything, right? And people have a lot of faith in science. A lot of times people that don't even understand how science works, right? So that if you ask, people what they believe in, and they'll say, well, I believe in science, right? Which is good because science is a good method of discovering the truth about empirical reality. But some people want to take that a little bit too far and say, so that they can have the idea that they can know everything, they can be certain about everything. They want to say, well, there's nothing outside the realm of science, right? There's nothing that science can't measure. And that fills that need for certainty for them because they say, I can understand anything using science. Right? But again, that's not really rational, is it? Because you can't prove that something um, that you cannot see does or does not exist. So I hope you understand there that way that this psychological need for certainty is also used um, by some people to kind of have what is actually like a devotion or faith in science as the ultimate and exclusive and complete way to know the truth. This reason, the condemnation of religiosity is understandable. It's hard to say that this is a bad reason because it really makes sense, and you can understand why people would reject the idea of God if they see it being used to do evil. So we see some people don't believe in the transcendent because of the evil things they have seen people do in the name of God, right? I call that bad religion or religiosity. So when people witness other people using the idea of God to abuse or take advantage of people, they respond by condemning those people and rejecting their ideas, right? So they might think these people are just trying to take advantage of other people. They're lying to us. Everything they're telling us is a lie. So they're telling us about this God so they can abuse us and oppress us. Well, this isn't real. So those people might think there is no God and that they're just telling us this so that they can take advantage of us. You see, I mean, it makes sense, and you can understand why people would react that way. So this is certainly understandable, this reaction. but it's not purely reasonable, right? And again, I'm not calling people who react this way unreasonable. I'm just saying when you think about it, if you just think about it, um, without you know accusing anyone of anything or being critical of anyone, is it really reasonable to say that something doesn't exist just because people use the idea about it, right, for evil purposes? No, right? Furthermore, it would be wise for us to differentiate between what seems to be legitimate experiences and ideas about the transcendent. And if we look at the great faith traditions of the world, we'll see that these are experiences that help people go beyond themselves. They help people open up and realize that they are one with others, and so that they love and take care of them, right? And that legitimate experience of transcendence seems to be quite the opposite of what you get with these abuses of revelation, in this religiosity, which is basically people's self-centered desires to oppress others. So it's important that we look at the content and say, well, wait a minute, what is legitimate revelation, as Lofink will call it later in the semester, and what is religiosity? Are people just using ideas about God to oppress other people? So it'd be wise to differentiate that. Otherwise we could just end up throwing out a lot of good, right? Things that can really help us because people use uh, ideas associated with that revelation to do evil. Another reason people don't believe in God, or think they don't believe in God or a transcendent reality, is that they come to realize that they don't believe in a particular image of God that has been presented to them in their community. And so they might say, well, what they're telling me about God isn't right, so God doesn't exist at all, right? Or what they say about the transcendent is inaccurate, so I don't think there's any transcendent, right? So, for example, someone who raised in a community that thinks the creation stories in the Bible should be understood as historical and scientific facts, they might um, come to think, when they um, are presented with sound scientific theory, that science has proved the Bible wrong and that God does not exist, right? So they'd say, wait a minute, so this creation story isn't right. So all this stuff must be made up and there's probably no God anyway, right? So again, this is kind of a misunderstanding there, because what's happening is that they're taking a bad interpretation of Revelation, right? They're thinking that something that was not intended to be historical, taken historically or scientifically, is. And so then they're saying, well, that's not true, so none of this is true. Again, this reaction is understandable, but you have to realize, just because a particular idea about God or religious teaching is lacking or incorrect, it doesn't mean that the transcendent does not exist, right? It just means it doesn't exist the way these people think it does. And finally, our last reason, which once again is going to be about personal experience, is people might not have had, or they don't recognize the implication of subtle and common personal experiences of the transcendent or God. So, number one, it's possible that some people might not have felt feelings of love, union, meaning, or other experiences of the transcendent. I mean, that is possible, that someone never felt those things. More likely, however, um, many people seem to have experienced these experiences. Many people believe in love at some form or have felt meaning in their lives, but they don't interpret them as a subtle experience of the transcendent, but often as they just think it's imaginary or not real. It's just an idea, it's just a feeling. They don't give credit to it. And then finally, people might have these experiences and might, lend some credit to them. They might say, oh, this is a real experience that I have, but they don't associate it with the transcendent God. They don't follow through, right? It's like meaning. Like, a lot of people say they experience meaning in life, but they don't really think about what that means. They don't realize, let's follow that through. if I believe that this isolated event has some invisible connection to other events, that's kind of believing in something that is beyond my ordinary sense experience, and also takes uh, that event and myself at some level outside, right, of itself. So we see, like, love, for example, is often overlooked as an experience of the transcendent. But what are you talking about? You're talking about love, an invisible union or connection between individuals, right? That's a transcendent experience, meaning a thing, person, or event has significance that goes beyond itself, right? That's transcendent, beyond everyday human experience. Well, a feeling of oneness or union with things, right? So you feel connected to things outside of yourself, right? You can't prove it. You can't say, oh, look, here, I have a connection with all nature. Can't you see it? We're all one. Can't you see it? No, people can't see that. People see separate individuals, separate beings. But these subtle experiences of the transcendent, people feel, right? Something beyond that. So, what I'm saying here, and we're going to pick it up in the next video, is if you believe in meaning, love, or anything that takes you beyond yourself, right? Anything that you can perceive with your five senses, then you believe in a transcendent reality in some way. Now, maybe it's not the same one that your pastor at your church believes in. Maybe you don't believe in the exact same way, right? It would be the same transcendent reality, perhaps, but not the same way. Maybe you don't believe in the same way that your neighbor does, or that your grandma does, right? Or even your best friend does. But if you believe, right, in these subtle experiences, meaning, love, union, right, then you believe in some kind of transcendent reality. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about God.